Good morning, everyone. I'm Suraj Sharma from Global Upside, and welcome to today's virtual open house. Our panelists will begin by addressing the top HR, payroll, and finance considerations when expanding into France and conclude with a question and answer session. Please enter your questions via the chat window located at the bottom of your screen at any time. We will answer your questions in the order they are received. If we are not able to address all questions during our live session, we will respond to you individually via email. These questions and answers are intended to be used for information and guidance purposes only, not as legal advice. Now let's meet our panel. First up, I'd like to introduce our VP of Human Resources Solutions, Mary Lemons. With over 25 years of experience, Mary helps support our clients across all aspects of HR, from providing adjunct services to multinationals in need of a strategic HR partner, to creating scalable and efficient HR infrastructures. Prior to Global Upside, Mary held leadership positions at several companies, including Active Identity and Cashflow. Our next contributor is Andrew Wilson, VP of Strategic Accounts. Andrew helps some of the world's leading companies tackle complex global HR and payroll challenges. Prior to Global Upside, Andrew worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Oracle, and also consulted for companies like Nestle, P&G, and Pepsi-Cola. Also on our panel is Nathan North, Director of Global Payroll. Nathan helps our clients develop robust payroll processes, systems, policies, and programs. Prior to Global Upside, Nathan managed global payroll for leading employers like Netflix. Over to you, panelists.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you for the introduction there. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to walk through the key considerations first in terms of the doing business in France, and then talking more specifically about the questions that you've submitted. In terms of the legal entity setup and what your ways that you can establish a legal presence in France and do business and employ personnel, your options are very much from the liaison office or the representative office, which is typically a vehicle for you to enter into the country for a short period of time for exploratory purposes, usually 1 to 2 years. You can use a branch in terms of a U.S. company establishing a branch there. Branches have become less popular just because they don't give you the legal presence and the entitlement to protections from the company law and employment law in France. So they are less likely to be able to help you in terms of representation in court. Normal legal entity formats in terms of wholly owned subsidiaries, SAS, SARL, which is the most popular in SA. And then France does retain the option of a U.S. company registering as a non-resident employer for payroll taxes and statutory benefits, which does entitle you actually to enter into an employment agreement with a French employee and establish payroll and pay payroll taxes and pay statutory benefits on behalf of the employee. So good option if you don't want to actually have a legal presence there. In terms of the setup and the company law compliance, it's pretty typical in terms of obviously having local directors, but these can be U.S. citizens in terms of establishing it, and there is the traditional company law compliance. France, unlike other countries that we typically say it takes you 30 to 45 days to establish and set up in terms of doing business from starting the application for incorporation. France is a little bit different in terms of you incorporate the legal entity first, but you're actually not allowed to matriculate, i.e. do the registrations for the payroll taxes and the statutory benefits until you actually have a French employee who has actually accepted your offer of employment and entered into an employment contract with you. So it does vary in terms of that, which extends the process typically to more like 60 to 75 days to set up operations there. From an accounting perspective, it's pretty standard in terms of setting up. Obviously, there is a requirement for the multi-currency and the local translation requirements. But the only difference there is that depending on the size of the operations, usually determined by financial means, that you are required, once you get above a certain size, to file statutory accounts with the government. But they do have value-added tax, which is implemented there, which, as you might know, is a fairly onerous tax on and goods and services, as well as normal income taxes. Requires you to prepare the tax returns on a quarterly and annual basis, and obviously make the payments if you have anything due, as well as obviously the income tax on an annual basis. Employment options. Obviously, if you're having someone who is typically a part-time employer that you do not want to hire directly, which is typically 20 hours or less, then you can hire them as an independent contractor from the U.S. company. If you do not want to establish a legal presence, both ourselves and other companies that we do business with do have the concept of a professional employer organization where they have a legal entity in the country, and they have the payroll and human resources services to support the employee, but they would work at your direction. Or you have the direct hire options in terms of the liaison office, as well as the wholly owned subsidiary and the branch. In terms of employment contracts, they do have concepts of fixed-term contracts, as well as short-term contracts and long-term contracts, and there are provisions over the amount of renewals that can occur. There are termination protections, and there are collective bargaining agreements and works councils. A lot of the employment law changed in 2017 when President Macron, through decree, which was unusual in terms of actually making changes to employment law, not requiring them to be approved by the government. Changed by decree some significant parts of the actual employment laws, really without the approval. However, with the consultation with the unions who are very strong in France. Key sections which were changed. There was a lot of development down from really negotiating at the national level through the unions down to really in-house discussions between the workers and the employees. So that was a major change from having the unions negotiate on a national basis. There was also changes in terms of how terminations were allowed by companies that did not have profitable French operations, but did have global operations, which allowed a lot more in terms of workforce reductions. There was a codification more in terms of the severance or termination payments, which were due to employees, rather than them leaving them to negotiation with the union or through the labor tribunal. There's has to be a codification in terms of what your entitlements are based on the length of service that you have with a company. So really trying to take away the power from the unions in terms of what they can negotiate on a case-by-case basis in terms of damages. And there were also changes in terms of the small firms, less than 50 employees. There was a lot less regulation as it relates to the collective bargaining agreements applying to the labor laws, and allowing you to actually have a lot more flexibility in terms of the negotiation, the work conditions they have. And then there are also changes in terms of the short-term contracts or renewal periods and things of that nature, and also how workers could actually apply for termination benefits and damages that relate to their employees. So a lot of changes have come as a result of the 2017 labor reforms. They are still very much obviously a work in progress with the unions actively striking against them, but very interesting in terms of how France is trying to open up its environment and become a lot more friendly in terms of the labor conditions over there. In terms of benefits, obviously there's the typical statutory and supplemental and discretionary benefits, such as private medical insurance, life insurance, enhanced pension and savings plans. And there is, but a lot of the collective bargaining agreements still do apply in terms of defining if you work in a specific industry and your company is subject to that specific industry's collective bargaining agreements, then a lot of the benefits are defined within the collective bargaining agreements that you have to provide. Payroll, again, obviously France has probably one of the most detailed payroll systems, and has obviously, because of all of the requirements as it relates to the collective bargaining agreements and the labor code. It's a very onerous pay slip with lots of calculations in terms of allowances and deductions. So don't be surprised to come across extensive pay slips with all of these summarized. And then, as we said, in terms of the hire to retire, lots of conflicting rules which are being trying to be codified by the government there at the moment in terms of the application of the Code du Travail and the new decrees that are coming in, as well as the collective bargaining agreements on how employment is governed. So that's a quick overview from my perspective.
Great, thank you, Andrew. That was a great overview. Let's move on to some of the questions that have come in. The first question we have here is, what are the time tracking requirements in France?
Hi, Suraj. This is Nathan. I'll go ahead and take that question. Under French law, all employees must track their time. So it's very important that all employees track the hours that they work. This is it includes all executives and all regular employees as well. So everybody on payroll, and I'm emphasizing this point, must track their hours. The standard work week in France is 35 hours. That is very important. However, please note that your collective bargaining agreement may set a different standard. So make sure you're always checking the CBA. And then also, your employees cannot work more than 44 hours a week on average over a 12-week period. However, again, make sure you're checking your CBA.
Perfect. Thank you, Nathan. The next question is, can we provide guidance in translating and understanding the employer and employee payments when processing payroll?
Yeah, so the French authorities make it very clear that payroll must be processed in French. And Andrew alluded to the payslip, for example, as being very extensive with the items that are listed and the summaries. There's usually between 35 to 40 elements listed on the payslip. I do recommend that if you do not understand French, to have your payslip translated by a professional translator that can give you a good overview of what each item is. And then you need to reverse calculate the items so that you understand what calculations are being put in place.
Great. And expanding on that point, who are the payroll, HRIS, ATS, and other systems vendors that can handle global clients, including France?
I'll say that's right. So obviously, we're looking at global providers. There are small company providers such as Intuit with PayScale, Paychex. The larger providers, obviously, ADP, Northgate, Ceridian, Celergo. In terms of the HRIS vendors, really Oracle, SAP, ADP providers, ATS. I think as we alluded to, and we do offer our own system, MIHI, in terms of the time attendance tracking, and also because France has a lot of statutory leave requirements which are required to be reported to the government, then you really are looking at time and attendance systems that track the hours, especially when you have these requirements in terms of the 35-hour work week, the 44-hour average work week over a 12-week period, and a maximum allowed there 48 hours a week. So a lot of that needs to be tracked and needs to be communicated, and the government has the right to audit it. So really a lot of emphasis on time and attendance and statutory leave management systems.
Great, thank you. And building on that point as well, how are RTT, reduction of work time days, calculated and paid out, and how is the vacation accrued and paid out?
Suraj, let me start with that. First off, as Nathan has said, the standard work week in France is 35 hours, and any hours over 35 would be overtime and paid at that increased rate of pay. So the concept of RTT was for high-level employees, instead of calculating work hours, French law allows employers to enter into an employment contract that provides for an agreement in terms of work days rather than work hours. And these extra rest days that are calculated are called the RTT days. And as Nathan said, they vary annually from year to year, and is also determined by the CBA that would be applicable as to how many work days there are. There is an ongoing responsibility that the employer communicate with the employee about their workload every year to determine that they're able to balance their professional and personal life. With that, Nathan, I'll let you talk a little bit further about vacation and payout.
Yeah, and in regards to RTT days, I'd like to add that it is very important that payroll and HR work hand in hand in understanding the handoff between both teams. So understanding the employment contract and following the employment contract is important, and any items that seem ambiguous to payroll are clarified with the HR team, so that way everybody remains in compliance. In regards to the unused vacation time, number one, most folks in Europe take their time off. That's usually not a question. But in the event that someone does not take their time off, and especially the 12 consecutive days that must be taken off between May 1st and October 31st, which is a requirement, we can't force employees to take time off. However, unused leave in most cases cannot be carried forward.
And so when it can't be carried over, how do companies handle that at year end?
So in France, the time off, which actually Andrew was talking about earlier, is reportable to the government if you have employees who have not taken all of their time off, and the company is subject to fines and penalties. And even though the employee may not receive monetary reimbursement for their time off, though the collective bargaining agreement may grant additional days off in the following year.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Nathan. Now, it looks like we have a question that is stating that they are very interested in general employment matters in France. Fixed-term contracts versus indefinite contracts, contractors, and terminations. Can we expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Thank you, Suraj. So just as there's a risk of misclassifying independent contractors in the U.S., it's the same for France. However, in France, a bogus self-employment can bring up 3 years of imprisonment and a fine for employers. So this is something that you really want to pay attention to on how you are determining the classification of an independent contractor. Most of the tests that we use in the U.S. to determine independent contractor status are somewhat similar in other countries as well. For example, a long-term contractor who works full-time exclusively for your business will most likely be considered an employee in France. An important step is to clearly state the scope of the services, the compensation, and the terms in a written consultant agreement. And this agreement should establish contractor status by showing independence and a lack of control about how the contractor performs the work. However, this written contract can easily be challenged, so it's not enough to prove your case, and you'll need justification on the truly independent nature of the work assignment. For fixed-term contracts, as already stated, they are permitted but limited in scope to replace somebody on a short-term leave, seasonal work, apprentices, or internships. And they're also limited in duration and may be renewed a certain number of times. You'll want to make sure that you're meeting the requirements for fixed-term contracts. And then indefinite contracts, this is the standard form of employment contract. There is no time limit, and either party may end the contract at any time, provided the notice periods are respected. However, terminating in France is not easy. And in general, there's 4 main ways of terminating, which one would be resignation, 2 would be a dismissal, 3 would be redundancy, and 4 would be mutual termination. And each of these general types of terminations involve different procedural steps that are vital to follow. When it comes to poor performance, it alone does not constitute an admissible ground under French law for dismissal. The employer must demonstrate the employee is incapable or lacks skills for carrying out the work in a satisfactory manner. Again, even following that, based on my own experience, it's virtually impossible to terminate an employee, definitely that's on the Works Council for gross misconduct, or even employees with poor performance.
Great, thank you, Mary. Let's circle back to the CBAs really quickly. How do you determine collective bargaining agreements and understand the employer's requirements such as length of probation period or notice period?
So about 90% of companies are subject to CBAs. And so the main activity, if your business is engineering, consulting, or IT, most of those types of companies are covered under the Syntex CBA. Other CBAs we see in our business is retail, trade, and metallurgy. It's important to determine precisely which CBA is applicable to your company, and on occasion we've had to do a full study to determine if the CBA is not clear. CBAs can dictate length of probationary periods, notice periods. Obviously, we talked about changes in the employment law. RTT days would be determined here, and insurance for sure.
Great, thank you. The next question is, why is it that URSSAF deductions that are on employee payslips do not always match the final quarterly amounts that must be paid?
So I'll just take that question. The URSSAF, which is translated into Organizations for the Collection of Social Security and Family Benefit, actually, so the contributions that are shown on the payslip should not be more than 2 to 3 euros off, and actually should be reconciled to what is reported. And actually, there is now a monthly URSSAF contribution option, which then guarantees that your reporting to the URSSAF will match the payslip.
Great, thank you. Are options received in an employee recognition program taxable? If so, is this at issuance or upon redemption for rewards?
So any time that there is any monies received by an employee, whether it's through employee recognition program, it would be considered taxable upon redemption.
Great, thank you. And just to summarize, what are the benefits, dangers, or considerations in France?
So my personal experience is one of the challenges if you're in a rapidly changing market where you have this software talent that perhaps you're going to need that software talent in a couple months, is that it can be very difficult to retool your workforce for the skills that you need. You have obligations to retrain, and possibly find other employment opportunities for employees. But on the other side, I personally found the French to be very industrious and productive people in the workforce, and the 35-hour work week that gets commented on often is often not a reflection of the productivity levels of the French employees.
Great, thank you. And then can we briefly explain what VAT is, and is there anything else that's unique about France?
I think in terms of France, obviously the value-added tax requirements throughout Europe and actually some of the other Asian countries as well. It is a tax on goods and services, consumption tax, and it is very much surrounding recording on all invoices sent to vendors, to customers, as well as invoices received from vendors, making sure you collect all the information, report it on the course of our annual basis, and make the requirements. So obviously every country differs in terms of what is subject to the taxes, and the rates obviously change from country to country. So I don't think France is any way particularly different in terms of the overall philosophy of the tax, but it is different in terms of the goods and services that are subject to it, and the rate does change.
Great. So thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you all for attending. We have several more questions in the queue and we'll respond to you individually via email. You can also reach out to our panelists individually as their emails are shown on your screen. Thank you all for your time today, and we look forward to you joining our next virtual open house.